Bueno, primero unas breves palabras en español para agradecer. Voy a agradecer en español a Eugenia por la invitación a participar acá y darnos a todos la oportunidad de encontrarnos en Atenas y en esta magnífica École Française d'Athènes. Y a cada uno de ustedes con los que estamos compartiendo este seminario, porque ya el tiempo que hemos compartido ha sido una muy bella experiencia y creo que lo va a seguir siendo tanto intelectual como humanamente. Así que gracias. Bien, ahora pasamos a la exposición. This presentation focuses on the interaction between Chilean and Southern European left parties in the 1970s, which was marked by the political, human, emotional, and theoretical impact of the brutal military coup in September 1973, brought the demise of the democratic path to socialism and installed a dictatorship perceived as fascist in Chile. Transatlantic interaction after April 1974 was also marked by the collapse of family-like dictatorships similar to the Chilean junta in Portugal, Greece, and Spain, alongside the simultaneous political empowerment of the left in these southern European countries as well as in Italy and France. This paper is underpinned by a constant dialogue between my hypothesis on the already mentioned transatlantic interaction between contemporary Southern European and Chilean left, the historical knowledge of their trajectory, and work with archival sources, periodicals, and bibliography that I have already compiled on several of the above-mentioned countries. My paper engaged with the historiographical debates on democracy and socialism, fascism and capitalism, totalitarianism and revolution, and within the paradigm of the global Cold War that I will also seek to test here. My main hypothesis is that during the second half of the 70s, the lessons learned from the Chilean experience helped to shape a transatlantic debate between the left on both sides of the Atlantic to hold the debate related to the emergence of Eurocommunism and socialism liberal shift or liberal turn. This transatlantic debate also overlapped with the trajectories and national mutations of intertwined political cultures, which I seek to investigate, interpret, and represent precisely through their interconnections. Given my language skills, while the research considers Southern Europe, including Greece, the work with primary sources is concentrated in files and newspaper archives in countries whose languages are accessible to me: Chile, Spain, Italy, France, and Portugal. Chile in a global context. Over recent years, diverse historians have engaged in innovative research on the interviewing of Chile's political and social trajectory with the global Cold War and the Inter-American Cold War. This research has focused on studying interactions between the South American country and global politics between around 1947 and circa 1973. However, the study of what we have called the new internationalization of Chilean politics after the military coup is still incipient. There are many bibliographical references. With this project, we seek to contribute to knowledge of this new phase of internationalization of Chilean politics that began with the military coup and the dictatorship's installation, which we studied through 1982. The global impact of President Allende's Chilean path to socialism as an unprecedented attempt to make the transition from capitalism to socialism in a peaceful, democratic, pluralistic framework of respect for human rights turned Chile into a model experience for the Western left between 1970 and 1973. At the same, it put the country on the front line of the East-West confrontation and the North-South divide. Its tragic end and the installation of a military junta in power with the support of global anti-communism, which, while loathed by a broad and ideologically pluralistic sector of the world, also put Chile at the center of global concern. The mass exile of leaders and members of the Chilean left to every continent, in addition to the urgent need for external support on the part of the parties opposed to the dictatorship, also led to the internationalization of the opposition persecution and the regime's forging of ties with the global right wing. All of this caused far denser political and ideological ties to be forged between Chile and the world. The Soviet Union and its European allies joined Cuba not only as place of asylum for thousands of Chilean leftists, but they also put their resources and infrastructure at the service of political action on the part of leftist parties outlawed in Chile. Immediately after the coup, Radio Moscow started a special daily program directed by a binational team, Chilean Soviet, called Listen Chile, which achieved a huge audience in Chile during the years of tightest censorship and control of information. Shortly after the coup, the foreign leadership of the Chilean Communist Party set itself up in Moscow and the Chilean Socialist Party in East Berlin. By late 1976, the Secretary General of the Chilean Communist Party, Luis Corvalán, was released after 3 years in prison after being swapped for the Soviet dissident Vladimir Bukovsky. The ideological and political training of Chilean cadres in countries with real socialism was expanded and even included military training in some cases. The tragic end of the Chilean path to socialism opened up a debate in the global left and, in particular, within the international communist movement regarding the reasons for the defeat or failure of Chile's Unidad Popular. This debate was at the source of what became known as Eurocommunism, which converted the Leninist thesis of the necessary, the Leninist actualized thesis, convert this Leninist thesis of the necessary correlation of favorable forces in each stage on the path to socialism, including electoral force among others. Eurocommunists convert this test into the need to unite a very broad and heterogeneous majority of the population around a project of social change that articulated progress toward the socialist economy while preserving political liberty or freedom and cultural pluralism. Thus, progress will be made toward the socialism that explicitly distanced itself from Soviet ideology with its commitment to pluralist democracy and human rights conceived as universal values and permanent conquest of humanity. In contrast, the defense of the revolution understood as the will and capacity to defeat the counter-revolution, including militarily, was to become the main motivation behind the Soviet ideological narrative on events in Chile. Soviet is German, Cuban narratives. Chile and Southern Europe in the global debate of the left. The global debate in the left on the lesson to be learned from the Chilean experience gained particular traction in Southern Europe. These countries, along with their proximity to or shared linguistic identity with Latin America, except for Greece, in particular showed a certain family resemblance to Chile inasmuch as their political cultures were concerned, in addition to the more or less close ties between political actors who shared ideological identities across the entire range of the political spectrum in the 20th century. In 1973, Spain and Portugal were still under right-wing dictatorships established in the fascist era and acclimatized to the Cold War, in whose framework the military dictatorship in Greece had been enthroned. But despite this, in Chile democracy, in these countries dictatorship, rightist dictatorship, despite this, their political cultures bore family resemblance to other Southern European countries and Chile. Unlike the Iberian Peninsula and Greece, in Italy and France, not just political cultures, but also the articulation between institutions, party system, and civil society bore family resemblance to the Chilean configuration of the same areas. This was even one of the reasons behind the US government hostility toward the Chilean socialist experience between 1970 and 1973, that the exemplary nature of the Chilean path to socialism could take hold in countries like France and Italy. There, they could understand the Chilean experience as a successful attempt to overcome the limits of dependent capitalism and to start the construction of socialism, spearheaded by an alliance between communists and socialists in a framework of respect for democratic practice, political pluralism, and civil rights and freedoms. In the brief historical and conceptual framework presented, I shall study how the experience of the left in the South American country, from the rise of the Chilean path to socialism to its persecution under Chilean fascism, occupied central space in the political imaginations of the left in France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Relatively central, but central. This is translated into an analysis of how and in what ways the tragic end of the 3 years of democratic, peaceful, and pluralistic transition to socialism in Chile made the mark on, first, debate within the unstable French communist socialist coalition created in 1972 and which led Mitterrand to the Élysée Palace in 1981. 2. The shift by Italian communism, which in 1973 moved toward reaching a historic commitment with the Christian democracy and the deepening of its criticism of the Soviet model for building socialism, which culminated in 1981. 3. The socialist Lenin Carnation Revolution in Portugal between 1974 and 1975. And 4. The transition to democracy in Spain following the death of Franco in 1975 until the Socialist González administration came to power in 1982. The project results will be materialized in 3 articles and a book whose title, as suggested Gerardo Lehner. The first of the articles will address the presence of the Chilean past defeat and the subsequent installation of the dictatorship in leftist debate during the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. The second will focus on the interaction between the metamorphosis of the Chilean experience and the Euro-communist debate in the left. The third will analyze the ascent of democratic socialism in the left and its relationship with the gradual displacement of anti-fascism for defense of human rights in solidarity with the resistance to the Chilean dictatorship. The resistance in all its heterogeneous manifestation. Some hypotheses. The internalization and centrality of the Chilean issue, or relativity centrality of the Chilean issue in Southern Europe left, was sustained by this family resemblance between their political cultures and the Chilean left. The similarities in the ways they articulated between institutions, the party system, and civil society, in addition to the political, cultural, and personal ties that had been established based on these resemblances. The political and theoretical debates, the other hypothesis, the political and theoretical debates on the Chilean experience among the Latin European left, socialist, communist, and gauchist, in addition to the political trajectories that began to wave together, simultaneously influenced the ideological debates and the political trajectories of the Chilean left in exile and in the country between 1973 and 1982. To me, it's very important to emphasize that these transnational ties are not centered only in exile. I will be too glad to explain more widely this point in Spanish. And in a dialogue with the presentation of Marcelo. Good. Other hypotheses. In the global ideological and particularly European context, in the second half of the 70s, issues like articulation between democracy and socialism on a revolutionary horizon gradually tended to be displaced by issues such as the articulation between capitalism and democracy and the defense of human rights as a gesture of transgression and or humanitarian empathy. The methodology of my research. To achieve the general and specific project objectives based on the historiographic perspective presented and the hypothesis formulated in the preceding page, a method inherent to the discipline of history will be used. One focused on identifying, selecting, and analyzing relevant primary sources in addition to dialogue with previously published academic work on the complex study object that we have configured. Given the nature of this study object, a transnational interaction between political stakeholders and cultures characterized by its complexity and multidirectionality, primary research includes a wide variety of sources and documentary and audiovisual files, as well as newspaper archives and libraries in 5 of the countries involved in the interregnum: Chile, France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Thus, it aims to cover the diverse levels on which reflection and representation of the left are configured, communicate among each other, and circulate, selecting the most relevant archival, newspaper, bibliographic, and audiovisual sources to get to know the discourse of the political actors and intellectuals of that ideological orientation. It is a complex discourse that is not without tensions or inconsistencies, aimed not just at the construction of their own identities or the strengthening of their respective political cultures, but the formation of national and international public opinion.